things like dime novels. All right. Like I mentioned, Oberlin was the first college to admit women. More and more reading was done. Oh yeah, another profession that started to be taken over by women was acting. In Shakespeare's day, for instance, in in the play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet was always played by a young boy. They did not allow female actresses on stages, but in the 1800s they started letting women come on stage, and female acting before this time had been frowned on. Oratory, a big thing back then. Daniel Webster was a really famous speech maker, and a story goes around. Daniel Webster one time argued with the devil and won an argument with the devil. The story called The Devil and Daniel Webster, and another one called The Devil and Tom Walker, where Tom Walker lost his argument with the devil. But Daniel Webster argued with the devil and won. Of course, this is obviously make-believe, but it shows how an influence Daniel Webster had. Now, Daniel Webster is not the Webster of the Webster's Dictionary. That was a distant cousin of his, Noah Webster. Daniel Webster was a senator from New England, I believe Massachusetts, who strongly spoke up for the Union. And he did not live long enough to see the Union divided. All right, Second Great Awakening. A big religious revival occurred at this time, known as the Second Great Awakening. Now, these revivals featured a lot of emotionalism, a lot of tears, a lot of camp meetings. Some of you might wonder, what is a camp meeting? Well, in those days, people would gather for miles around and actually camp. Sometimes they had tents, and sometimes they camped in their wagons, and sometimes they just slept on the ground out in the open. And yes, they could get rained on, but they held their meetings. They'd get up in the morning, eat breakfast, then go to listen to sermons all day long. First would be one preacher in the morning, another preacher in the afternoon, then the featured speaker would be the night speaker. And between times, they'd eat their lunches and eat their suppers and go back. The camp meeting is still popular in some circles with some denominations.
Yeah. People still do that today.
What's that?
People still do that today.
People still do it, yes, it's still done. Well, Pentecostal people do that. What's that?
It'll last several weeks, like this book is saying. It'll last several
They, I don't know if they last several weeks anymore. Maybe just a week or so. Maybe they don't. I don't know.
Sometimes a weekend.
A weekend, sometimes just a weekend. But people get together and camp out, or they've any more than most of them rent cabins. People don't sleep on the ground much anymore, but they'll rent cabins, and the cabins have shower facilities and heat and air conditioning, amenities of home. So it's not quite like they're roughing it. But these camp meetings, and those last several weeks. The Second Great Awakening is said to have started in Kentucky. Now, it was mostly among evangelical churches, particularly the Baptist and Methodist. Pentecostals as such did not exist in the 1830s. But it was mostly the Baptist and Methodist. And I must say this, for many, many generations, the main two religions in the South were were Baptist and Methodist. And today, though, it's still Baptist and Pentecostal. Pentecostal was very divided, but the Methodist Church has declined greatly in recent years. Not being critical, folks, just stating what I've observed. Now, if you think you know differently, your input is welcome. But today, it's still Baptist and a lot of Pentecostals. But in those days, now, here was where, all right. Like I said earlier, the Great Awakening featured a whole lot of emotionalism. Did it last? For a lot of people, when the revival was over, they'd go back and live the same old way they had before, and it would make no serious difference. But there are some things that are believed to have been permanently changed as a result of the revivals. Number one, the idea of predestination was broken down largely, not completely. Predestination meant that you could not change anything. Well, that everything was predetermined, but people began to think, we can take responsibility, we can change society. Well, what did they want to change? They wanted to change slavery for one thing, get rid of slavery, and for another, they wanted to get rid of drinking. It's called a temperance. Get rid of slavery, get rid of drinking,
Excuse me, sir,
and get rid of a few other, yes.
would the predestination include the temperance? All
No, they're separate from it. Yes. But predestination means that you have no control over anything. Everything is preordained and predetermined. We're completely machines, and we have no free will. That's predestination is extreme. Where they began, and also you could not try to be saved. You were either saved you were not, and that was already determined before the foundation of the world. That God knew before He made the world who would be saved and who wouldn't, and you had no control over it. Well, people began to believe, hey, we can decide whether or not we're going to be saved. And this changed. Then we just got to thinking, well, if we can decide that, we can decide that we can change the world. We can get rid of alcohol drinking. We can get rid of houses of prostitution. They also want to get rid of houses of prostitution and other things that they consider vice and sinful. One of the big leaders of the Second Great Awakening was Finney. Now, there were a whole lot of other preachers, but Finney is the one your book mentions most, and Finney is the one I mentioned.
It's Charles Finney, right?
Charles Finney, yes. Charles G. Finney. Again, if you study these men closely, as I have, you'll find that some of them had some serious faults in their theology. In the case of Finney, he went to England one time. I've got to tell you this. And he tried to preach, everybody is equal in the sight of God. Well, he ran into the English noblewomen. No, I'm not equal to those poor peons down there. I'm better than they are. And Finney actually adjusted his preaching to accommodate them. Folks, this is just a historical fact. But Finney began preaching about the time, shortly after the Erie Canal was completed. That was important in his life because he went up and down around the Erie Canal, mostly between Albany and Buffalo. That's where he started out. Then he wound up, like I say, going to Europe also, and especially to England. He was a crowd mover. Now, these preachers appealed not to the intellect, they appealed to the emotion. They would try to move a crowd to tears. Now, that was not as hard to do in those days as it would be today. Today, thanks to the invention of television and movies, we can sit and watch a movie that would have shocked our ancestors and it won't even faze or move us at all. And my wife has maybe marked that some of the movies that she has seen lately, and that I've seen too, get low ratings. And she said, hey, I thought that was a good movie. I said, these people have seen so many movies that the people who rate them, that an ordinary movie like the one that she saw just doesn't excite some of these people. They've seen too many of them. Many years ago, Aristotle said a person should only see a play about once every 6 months because he believed that more than that, he became desensitized. And to some extent, that was true. Another thing that came about now as a result of the revival movements was several Christian colleges were started. You might not realize that all your Ivy League schools started out as Christian schools in view of what happened today. And nearby, Vanderbilt University also started out as a Christian school, but eventually the church lost it. But Vanderbilt was once a Christian school, but Christian schools were started, and this was a permanent change. Now, I'm not going to ask this on a test, but a woman started the American Temperance Society, which called for an end to all alcohol consumption. And here's why it became important, folk. I had a student do a paper on alcohol in Europe and in Western world. Every man and a lot of women before this time drank alcohol. It was just simply the socially acceptable thing to do. And then came the factories. And the factories, of course, the word factory connotes machinery. And the factory owners realized we can't have drunk people operating machines. Now, I can tell you stories at Lockheed where some people would come to work drunk and the company wouldn't fire them, would just simply say, take a taxi, go back home. They wouldn't let them drive if they could help it. But go home, you can't stay here today. But there was one man who was habitually drunk, and they just set him on a table where he wouldn't hurt anybody else, and his job was to assemble lugs on wires all day. He'd put lugs on the end of wires all day long, and that was his job. And again, wouldn't hurt anybody. But he was allowed to stay, even though they knew he was drunk most of the time he was there. But most of the factory owners realized that to operate factory machinery, they had to have sober workers. So they began to try to tell the churches, can you get your people to not drink? The churches began to teach against alcoholism. The Women's Christian Temperance Society was formed, and by the way, this still exists. WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Society, called for the end of all alcohol consumption. Now I'm going to jump ahead of the story a little bit. Where this was to lead was to the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment that outlawed the drinking and sale of drinks. The presidents at the time, President Harding and Coolidge and Hoover and Roosevelt, did not want to enforce it. And finally, under Roosevelt, the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st. The only amendment to the Constitution was repealed. But we'll talk more about it later. People, when the 18th Amendment did do a lot to curb drinking. Now you'll hear otherwise. Some people will say, well, people rebelled against it and people drank who'd never drunk before. Whatever, no, but I've got to say this about drinking. I mean, I've been called opinionated, but personally, I never touched the stuff. But there are countries in this world today that have outlawed drinking alcohol completely. And these countries do not have a lot of scientific and technological progress. And I had an older man one time in one of my classes, what is the connection between disallowing drinking and curbing scientific progress? And one of his classmates answered him. When you curb drinking, you're curbing every other freedom also. Scientific progress is made by people who are free to think for themselves. Curb drinking, stop drinking by legal means, and scientific progress will come to a slowdown. Anyway, yes?
Now, I don't want to get spiritual, but I do believe in the creator of all good. And the Bible even states where there's laws against don't do this, even though they have these right there.
Yeah.
Sin abounds even more. But so if you not saying that you encourage people to do what they want to do,
Right.
free will being, which is the creator of all good. He's a free will person thing, individual. He believes that he wants you to be saved, but you have the freedom to do that. So give you the choice
Yeah.
to do that. But
Well, if you read the New Testament, the theme that runs in St. Paul's writing is we are free from the law. We are not under the law. We're not bound by the law. We're not over and over and over again, over and over, not bound by the law. And when Christians started believing this after the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther started teaching freedom, it had some side effects. Number one, he got concerned because the female members started showing more and more of their bodies. But even this, I mean, as much as I believe in modesty, when you allow the women the freedom to dress in a way they want to, believe it or not, other freedoms, the freedom to invent things, the freedom to invent goes up too. So when you try to legislate morality through legislation, you're going against the will of God as expressed in the New Testament.
Right.
Give each person an individual and a personal. I say, I don't touch the stuff, and I strongly recommend that you don't use. But that's all I'll go. I'm not going to work to get Congress to pass a law to outlaw you from drinking. That's a personal choice. And the way you dress, I'll be right with you. The way you dress is a personal. And I'll tell you, man, I mean, I've heard a lot of men say, oh, but the way, hey, as long as your neck muscles are working and as long as your eyeball muscles are working, you can look away. Yes.
I was just gonna piggyback off of him. Like countries in Europe, drinking is normal.
Oh,
Like,
yeah,
it's not
right,
like
yeah,
a
right.
sin.
But then again, Europe and
And-
along the United States invented the light bulb, the automobile. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you're right, but like it's not like a bad thing in the European culture to drink, and so
Well, it depends.
well, yeah,
It
it depends,
depends.
but it's like it's not like frowned upon for the most part, and like it's not excessively like
so that's it.
Mostly it's controlled.
yeah.
But you're playing a game called Russian roulette. If you know what Russian roulette, recently an Army officer was arrested for it. You take a partly loaded revolver, spin the revolver, and then put it to your head and pull the trigger, and you hope that the gun just goes click. But if you get a bullet, you're going to die. In other words, you can become alcoholic if you drink. That's a fair warning. It can get a hold of you and control you, and it won't let go. And a lot of people who drink develop a problem. And I personally believe, and I'm not about to try to find out, I personally believe that I'm what's called a dry alcoholic. If I ever take a drink, and I don't know how much of these characters show up when I'm in front of you, but if I ever take a drink, I believe it'll grab me. Yes?
There's a study that says that you have a chemical imbalance if you're more, how do I put it in English, like if you're more into alcohol to the point where you will become an alcoholic. So if you are an alcoholic, most likely you already have that chemical imbalance. That's what the study has showed. So I don't necessarily think that, because I'm from Europe, I started drinking when I was 16 because it was legal. I'm almost 30, I don't drink anymore, I'm not an alcoholic. So unless you have that chemical imbalance, it's more likely for you to be an alcoholic or a drug user. So you can easily drink and not be an alcoholic.
Well,
You have to have that self-control.
Some people, though, can and some can't. And it's not a matter of self-control. If your body is tuned in that direction and you take the drink. All right, well, anyway, each his own. And again, I have not researched this in years. But I will say this. If you find yourself addicted to computer games, and if you find yourself addicted to sugary snacks, and if you find yourself going from one failed relationship after another, you might better not start drinking. There's some, now this is what I've read. All right, anyways, so much for this. Then the next thing was slavery. Some reformers wanted to gradually get rid of slavery, and there was a move to send slaves back to Africa, particularly Liberia. Well, a lot of richer white people would get together and they'd buy these slaves from Southerners and send them to Liberia. And here's the interesting fact. The stronger ones, black men in Liberia, former slaves, would enslave each other. They set up plantations. I mean, they set up the only kind of living they knew. They set up big plantation houses and plantation farms, just like they'd seen in the South, where they came from. And they enslaved each other and bought and sold each other into slavery. The stronger ones selling the weak. Liberia. And Liberia is still there, and they still remember that they started out copying what they'd seen in the South. A lot of Northerners, particularly factory workers, were turned against slavery because they realized if my boss were to go south, he could buy a bunch of slaves and bring them up here and not have to pay them a wage. And they felt like that slavery was a threat to them because the slave would work cheaper than they could, or than they would. So there came about anti-slavery movements. They had their beginnings here, and they were to continue. The big issue that separated the North and South throughout the 1840s and 1850s was slavery. And some Southerners have tried to change it, but the number one issue that started the Civil War that came later was slavery. Oh yeah, something else Charles Finney believed. He believed that you could live a perfect life here on this earth, that you could be completely free from all sin if you got close enough to God and prayed hard enough. You could live completely free from sin. I'm going to leave that for each of you to decide for yourself. But he believed that. Now, one of the more infamous events of Jackson's administration was the Trail of Tears, right nearby here. In fact, the capital of the Cherokee Nation was in Calhoun, Georgia, where I lived for 5 years myself, from 1975 to 1980. But the capital of Cherokee Nation was in Calhoun. The Cherokee Nation included Dahlonega, where there was gold found, and there's still some gold to be found there. And the Cherokee set up their own nation within a nation. A great Indian chieftain named Sequoyah developed a Cherokee alphabet, wrote Cherokee books. Some of your Cherokee Indians built mansions. Chief Van built a house that is still standing to this day. And I've been there. The house is located in a town called Spring Place. Have any of you been to these places by any chance? Okay. Anyway, the Cherokee Nation, Jackson wanted to remove them. The Indians took their case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Marshall, ruled in favor of the Indians against Jackson. Jackson said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Jackson got through Congress the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act had forcibly moved the Indians to Oklahoma. And here's what Jackson told me. He said, now once you get to Oklahoma, you'll be free. We white people will never go to Oklahoma. And in view of what happened, I mean, I see a couple of you smiling. I mean, in view of what happened later, that turned out to be ironic, but you'll never go to Oklahoma. Now, there were a few Indians who did not get moved. The Seminole Indians hid in the Everglades where the white men did not want to go. There were 8-foot-long rattlesnakes, and there were alligators and a whole lot of other critters that they didn't want to, but the Indians could handle that. But the Seminoles and their descendants were still there. And in North Carolina, in the mountains, some Cherokee hid out in the mountains where the white men did not find them, and their descendants are still there. When I was a kid, I've read that there were about 30,000 Indians still in the South, but the Indians that were forced to move, the place, it was called the Trail of Tears. A high percentage of Indians, your book gives the percentage, died on the trip. 1/4 according to your book, died along the way. Only 3/4 made it. But the Trail of Tears, I mean, did not go direct from Georgia to Oklahoma. It took a path that took it up through Illinois, and it's basically a roundabout path. And again, I don't know why that was, but it was a roundabout path that didn't take them direct to Oklahoma. But they got to Oklahoma, where within a generation or two, the white man started moving in. So they were not freed. They were in Oklahoma. They were, all right. Jackson said that the Indians would now live in peace and would gradually be assimilated into society. Again, the Indians have proven to be very difficult to assimilate, but lately some of them are. All right. Now, the Tariff of Abominations. The Southern people were against the tariff. High tariff. Not for the Southerners. Again, I've explained the tariff. Now, the Northern factory workers wanted a tariff. They said, our standard of living is higher than the standard of living of anywhere else in the world, but we need to protect that by keeping foreign goods out. So to keep the price of foreign goods high, we need to put a wall of a tariff to keep foreign goods out. The Southerners said, no, other countries won't buy our products if our tariff is too high. If we put a high tariff on our products, they'll put a high tariff. I mean, if we put a high tariff on their product, they'll put a high tariff on ours. And to some extent, that was true. Anyway, when they got Jackson to be president, Jackson was himself a Southerner, a Tennessean. And the Southern people thought, we got our man in office now. But they didn't realize Jackson wanted to build a strong army and a strong navy. Jackson's been a colonel and a general in the United States Army and had led the nation to victory, and he'd been a successful Indian fighter. He wanted to build up a strong military, and to do this he needed money. And again, folk, you get your man into a position of leadership, and all of a sudden sometimes he turns out to see things in an altogether different light. Executives see the whole world in a completely different light than the rest of us do, and you have to understand them. Jackson wanted money for the government, that is, not for his own pockets so much. So a tariff bill was passed by Congress, 1832, and signed by President Jackson. South Carolina said, that tariff is the tariff of abominations. We're not going to accept it here. We won't charge it here. And if anything, we're going to leave the Union. Jackson, at this point, Jackson and Calhoun split. Jackson and Calhoun had been friends. Now, there was another issue, a personal issue between them. Jackson had a cabinet member, his Secretary of War, John Eaton. John Eaton came to Washington a bachelor, and while in Washington he married a dance girl of questionable repute. I mean, in these high society Washington women, Jackson had no wife, so Mrs. Calhoun led Washington female society. These wives of officials would get together. Well, Mrs. O'Neill was not recognized socially by the other women. Now, keep in mind, Jackson's own dead wife had been slandered also, so Jackson sided with O'Neill, his secretary, and Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State at the time, also sided with O'Neill. But Mrs. Calhoun, the Vice President's wife, led the attack to kick Mrs. O'Neill out of society in Washington, out of high society. Jackson didn't like this a bit. To make a long story short, I mean, there's a few more details, but to make a long story short, Jackson and Calhoun split. Calhoun resigned from the vice presidency, thinking he could do more good in the Senate. He resigned from the vice presidency and got a seat in the Senate, becoming our first vice president to resign. The next one was Spiro Agnew, who resigned when I was a young man. But anyway, Calhoun resigned, and the split became between Jackson and Calhoun. When South Carolina threatened to leave the Union and declared through the doctrine of nullification, here was Calhoun's argument: what, a law that's good for one part of the country might not be good for another, and any state that thinks that this law that's passed by Congress will hurt them has a right to declare that law null and void in their state. This is the doctrine of nullification. Or in other words, and I'm going to quote my 8th grade history teacher here, the South Carolina legislature met one day and said, well, Congress passed a law recently, and we don't like that law, but let's see if we're going to obey it or not. Let's all take a vote. They took a vote and said, we're not going to obey that law. Yes?
So do you think this terrorist abomination, do you think they were still trying to catch up and get their money back from the wars?
It was actually more of an attempt. See, Jackson got the country out of debt.
Right.
So it was more of an attempt to build a strong military.
Okay.
See, we hadn't fought a war, except for Indian wars, had not fought a war in a long time at this point. By the time the last war had been about 18 years before. The War of 1812 ended 1814, so we had not fought a war in a long time. Anyway, Jackson acted decisively. He said, I will go to South Carolina myself with an army, and I will hang every one of those rebels, and I'll hang Calhoun first. I mean, this was the way he operated the presidency. We've not heard a president in my lifetime say anything like that. But he said, I'll hang Calhoun. The law that was passed by the federal government, the law that I signed, is to be obeyed by every state. The ships from Europe were starting to head towards South Carolina because they'd gotten wind that South Carolina was not going to collect a tariff. Jackson said, you're going to collect a tariff. I'll go down there personally have to and see to it that the tariff is collected. Henry Clay, for once, sided with Jackson. Jackson, you may recall, had challenged Henry Clay to a duel, and Henry Clay refused. But this time, Henry Clay sided with Jackson. Yes, the tariff law passed by Congress must be obeyed. Finally, though, Henry Clay came on the scene again and worked up a compromise. He said, well, I'll tell you what, South Carolina, if you'll go ahead and abide by the tariff, I'll work to get the tariff gradually reduced. So he began to do that, and South Carolina was promised the tariff be gradually reduced. A constitutional crisis was then averted. But the issue of nullification still remained on the books. The compromise at least worked temporarily and saved off war for several years. But Jackson also sent a bunch of armed ships to South Carolina and threatened to invade them. Both sides wound up feeling that they had won. South Carolina got its lower tariff, and it had nullified the law. Jackson had shown he was willing to act decisively to enforce federal law, but some South Carolinians still talked about secession, and we're going to learn later that when it came time for these states to decide to leave the Union, South Carolina was the first to go. All right. Now this leads us up to banking issue.